If you've ever struggled with paint bleed when stenciling, you know, that blobby mess that ruins the project, then you are in the right place. Stay tuned because I'm going to show you 3 tips to avoid that paint bleed, plus 3 basic painting techniques that you need to have in your creative toolbox. By the end of this video, you'll be confident to pick up that brush and tackle any stencil project. Tip number 1 is to choose a smooth surface, and this will give you the absolute best results when stenciling. Subtle to light texture is okay, but the most important thing is you want your stencil to be in contact and flush with your project's surface, so that no parts of that stencil are lifting up and exposing under the stencil. And for this demonstration, I'm just using a canvas paper, which is smooth with a very subtle texture. For your project though, you may need to give the surface a quick wipe down to clean any dirt and oil off before you begin. Tip number 2 is to secure and stabilize your stencil to the painting surface. I do this 2 ways with every project. First, I will use a repositional tack spray. Just be sure that the bottle says repositionable and not permanent. I do all of this type of spraying outside in a well-ventilated area, so I won't be showing it on camera. But all you need is a light spray on the back of the stencil. And don't stress, if you get too much of that spray tack, just grab a towel and remove the excess tack spray. This will keep the grip, but not damage the surface or leave a residue. As you can see here, I also like to press the stencil firmly with my hands, especially in those delicate and intricate parts of the design, just to make sure that the stencil is nice and secure. You can see here that my stencil isn't glued to the surface, it's just a light grip, and that holds it in place. And for extra stability, I also tape the edges of the surface. Seems like overkill, but it works every single time. Tip number 3 is the golden rule of stenciling, and that is after you've loaded up your brush with an even coat of paint, you must offload the majority of that paint. And you can see here, I'm just using a paper towel. You can use, say, a paper plate. But the idea here is that the brush should almost be dry to the touch. And you can see how much paint I'm going to use. Well, it might be a little less than I usually use, but this will give you an idea of approximately what you want to go for. The first technique is probably the most common, and that is to take a stipple brush or a sponge and swirl or dab that paint onto the stencil. I love to use these dome stipple brushes because the outer bristles are shorter and the center is slightly raised, and that's going to give you a lot of control. So when you are applying that color, those outer bristles aren't splaying out, which can go underneath the stencil. If you can't find a dome stipple brush, you can just take a regular stipple brush and give it a light trim with some scissors. I like to cut from the bottom to the tip, angling the corners inwards to create that beautiful dome shape. It's super easy and it works great. With my brush offloaded, I will swirl the surface of the stencil really lightly to give it a first coat. The trick is to work in thin layers and build that color up. This technique gives you so much control, and it's the one that I like to use when I'm using multiple colors or I want that slightly distressed or aged look. Now, if you're not using tack spray, no worries. Just use your fingers to hold down the stencil in the areas that you're working in. Alternatively, you can dab the brush or sponge, which is great for getting in those tight corners and doing some of the finishing work. And look how crisp and clean those edges are. It's so beautiful. The next technique is great when you need to get good coverage relatively quickly. An example would be stenciling, say, a large wall pattern stencil. You want to use a foam roller, and yes, it must be a foam roller, and I like to use them because of this round tip, which doubles as a dabber, again for those tight areas and finishing touches. Same workflow where you unload the roller to get a nice even coverage on the surface of the roller and then offload it as much as you can. When offloading using a roller, I like to give it a little press to make sure that that paint isn't sinking too deep into the foam. You can see that I'm rolling in light layers in one direction. So I roll one way, I lift the roller up, and then I roll again. You can notice that I'm not rolling back and forth, which can make the stencil shift. And again, it looks great. It's a little bit of a different look than the stipple brush, but still a nice clean edge. The next technique is a great one to use for card making, signs, even decorating cookies with icing. For this, you'll need a rubber squeegee or even just a plastic card. And for this technique to work, you have to use a thicker consistency of paint, such as a paste or a gel. Here I'm using chalk paste. I work straight from the jar, starting by giving a generous dollop of paint and then using the squeegee to lightly push the paint into the stencil design while removing it from the surface of the stencil. I'm putting the excess back in the jar. The end result is a beautiful raised texture look that is absolutely stunning. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you found it helpful. Before I sign off, I invite you to check out our description. I've put some informational goodies and a link to our stencil for you to check out.